That's great. I make no guarantees here. You may hear our cuckoo clock, you may hear our dog barking, but I'm ready to go this way. I want to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. I'm going to give a short talk. I've only got half an hour, and I want to leave some time for questions and discussions. But I hope you'll find it thought-provoking. It's a talk for teachers and students, one which I hope will make us all a bit more reflective about what the virtual environment we have here in Second Life affords us, and why it hasn't become more of a commonplace educational tool. To illustrate, I'm going to take you on a personal odyssey. Over on Renaissance Island, right next to the tall bell tower and the common in the center of the parish, there's a small, unassuming little stone cottage. Most visitors walk right by, and they don't pay any attention to it at all. But if you look closely at the sign by the front door, you'll see tool and how difficult it is to use it well. I came to Renaissance Island in June of 2009 as an educator who had well over 2 decades of experience designing and testing and using educational software in applied settings. I was interested in exploring the educational terrain in Second Life to find out what was being done here, and to learn how educators were being innovative in this virtual environment so that I could do that too. I figured it would take me about a month at most to get the basics under control so that I could begin bringing educational designs to life here based on the principles of human learning and cognition I had been studying for a whole career, and which I had developed over many, many years of research. And I assumed I could quickly begin to focus on pedagogical ideas, learn from more experienced educators, and begin being educationally creative pretty much right away. I was so very, very wrong. I was not prepared for Second Life. Not being an experienced gamer, I had had a hard time just moving around. I couldn't get from place to place in Second Life. Despite having worked through a variety of self-paced Second Life orientation locations, I ran into walls with alarming frequency. I had trouble getting clothes to fit. I didn't know where to get decent hair and skin. In short, I was embarrassing to be around. I don't know how many of you have had that experience, but it was disillusioning to say the least. And it wasn't very much later that I discovered that there were plenty of other educators who had the same problem. One college professor I met who was roaming around Renaissance Island that first summer told me, and I think this is almost a direct quote, "I just came to Second Life to get some ideas for getting students excited about learning. But I have no idea how to make any of that happen here. She never reappeared. And so I discovered the first disconnect between what educators want from a virtual world and what they find when they get here. What I found was that while educators want to focus on education rather than the nuts and bolts of everyday life, what they find when they get here is that there is a substantial learning curve just to exist within the context of this virtual world. I found that I liked Renaissance Island a lot because it already had a community of librarians and educators who were doggedly trying to figure out how to make the island educational. You heard from the current owner, Queen Catherine, who was Corrigan Keynes, and she was one of the reasons stuck around. And several of the people on Renaissance Island were actually bringing groups of college students in the world, so I decided that I would stay too. But during the summer of 2009, a decree went out from the island's managers and owners that everyone on the island should have a period-appropriate role, a role-play persona. And knowing that women in the Tudor era had limited options, and knowing that I did not have the chutzpah to be a duchess or countess, nor the patience and docility to be a lady-in-waiting, I decided I would become an educated member of the rising middle class in the Tudor era. I would become a physician. I started reading about medicine in the Renaissance period and quickly learned that women were not physicians. They were not admitted to universities in England, and so they could not become physicians. Women at best were midwives or wise women who knew about the uses of herbs and plants to cure illness. But no matter. I read about Sir Thomas More's extraordinary daughter, Margaret, who was educated broadly by her father. So I stretched the truth, and I gave myself an extraordinary Tudor physician for a father. His name is Thomas Linacre, and my story was that he had supposedly educated me to be a physician, even though I was a woman. Having made a commitment to medicine, I realized I would have to make my second life home into an accurate Tudor-era physician's residence, and that became the beginning of my journey as an educator in Second Life. First was the decision about what to include. For example, I had to figure out what kinds of furniture would have been in a Tudor home of that era. It turns out there was very little of it in a Tudor home, and most of it was wood, clunky looking, and the chairs were not very comfortable to sit in. So much for entertaining large parties. The tapestries were hung on the walls for display and insulation, and generally there were not rugs on the floor, but I put them in my house anyhow because I hate cold stone floors. And here's what the seating area in the physician's house looks like today if you go inside. At the time, I didn't know how to make chairs. Moreover, because of the limits on the number of prims I could use, I needed to know how to create furniture that would be both realistic and low prim. Whatever was available on the grid at that time was definitely not low prim. I had my choice of quite a lot of very realistic looking 15 prim chairs. And that gets me to my next point about education in a virtual world. As educators, we often want things to be a certain way, while in Second Life, things have to be created in the ways that Second Life permits or makes easy. And that means that the realities sometimes do not coincide and compromises have to be made. But one can do a great deal if one has patience and time, and a teacher will wind up making many of the same decisions that they do in real life, in the real world classroom, that is. What material am I going to include in this educational environment? How do I create that? But there is one more decision to be made. How can I embed the material in an immersive environment? After all, Tudor physicians did not have instructional posters on the walls of their homes explaining everything to the mostly illiterate Tudor public. So I made the decision that the education in the physician's house would be implicit in the objects, but with explicit descriptive materials for those who were interested in learning about them. When you go to the physician's home, you will see the kinds of things that would have been there, but you won't actually find out anything about them unless you click on them. In other words, the environment is immersive, but it's not instructional without a little work from the student. In the Renaissance Islands Physician's Home today, what you'll see are things that will give you information about astrology, which was a large part of the physician's knowledge base back then. Most had to major in astrology at the university to become a physician in the Tudor times. You'll also see portraits of major medical figures of the classical and Renaissance eras with information about them. Here I'm showing you the portrait of the famous French barber surgeon, Ambroise Paré, who pioneered in sterile surgery, among other things. It turns out he wasn't actually a trained physician. The barber surgeons were the ones with the practical knowledge about how the body worked and how to actually fix parts of it. Underneath Paré's picture on the wall there, you'll find a box of surgical instruments. As far as I can tell, they're fairly accurate for that era. And all of these objects will tell you a story if you click on them. I made the explicit decision to include material that was freely available on the web and to make sure that there were plenty of references for people who were interested in learning more. On the other side of the room, that's the room bigger actually, but on the other side of the room, you'll find a bleeding table and an apothecary's cabinet with a mortar and pestle for making medicines. And if you look carefully, you'll see that there's also a jar of leeches, just like the one I've put out here in the column at the front of the podium. Now, if any of you happen to need some leeches, you can take a copy of this jar with you right now. If you just want to know about the use of leeches, click on the jar and you'll get a note card about them. That jar of leeches is probably the single best example in the physician's house of the challenges facing an educator in Second Life. And that's why I put it in the title of my talk. Let me explain. After several months of working on this physician's house project, I came to the realization that a Tudor physician would have leeches. And I knew I couldn't just set a bunch of leeches out on a plate. They would have crawled away. And that meant I would have to create a jar for the leeches. A jar made of prims wasn't going to look right, which meant I had to somehow learn to make a sculpt. And I would have to learn how to put a custom texture on it with the right label. It took me about a week to make this leech jar and the texture that's on it. I had to find tutorials about making sculpts and tutorials on how to make textures for them, and even so, the label on the jar came out blurred and distorted, but I didn't care. And frankly, that's one of the most difficult things about trying to teach in a virtual environment, the fact that sometimes you don't know how to create the learning materials yourself. And even if you do figure out how to create them, it will take a really long time, and you often need a lot of help. So why then do we even bother to try to teach in Second Life? For one thing, a virtual world like Second Life affords us the opportunity to give students an experience that they could never have in real life. The instructors here for your library course, for example, have created an Italian Renaissance town within which the educational activities take place. It gives everyone a much better sense of what life is like, and it's better than just reading about it or even seeing it in a movie or a video. And as an aside, frankly, I've never understood why a school that has a physical campus would ever build an island that duplicated their real-world campus. And excuse me while I glance in disbelief over at the Stanford University region next door. While social spaces make sense and conventional classrooms might work for distance education where the students never see each other in real life, if students meet in a classroom on their home campuses in real life, why not give them something else in a virtual world? A second reason why it may be worth the trouble to teach in a virtual world is that it is immersive. Once you log in, you can't avoid being in the learning environment. And certainly all the best scientific and educational literature says that an immersive environment is the best way to have students engage with the materials that they're trying to learn. We know that engaged students learn more. We also know that students who are in a social environment also learn more. And certainly the immersive nature of the Second Life environment puts everyone in a social setting from day one. And finally, a virtual world is inactive if it's properly designed. The virtual environment gives the students the opportunity to decide what they will learn and how they will go about learning it. It wasn't until I had finished building the Physician's House on Renaissance Island that I realized I had learned a great deal more in the building of it than anyone else would ever learn if they read all of my note cards. And this led me to resolve that I would design future learning environments in a way that the people who needed to learn would have a role in deciding what was important for them to learn and in creating their own materials. Frankly, there is no better way for a student to learn something about a topic than have to try to explain it to someone else. Happily, the students here in the SJSU course have all picked topics related to the course content and have developed their wonderful displays out in back of the grandstand there and are giving presentations that reflect all the work that they have done to learn about their topics. So by way of conclusion, my own odyssey as a parish physician illustrates both the joys and perils of trying to do education in a virtual world. To be sure, Second Life has not lived up to the hype of a few years ago as the emerging mecca of education. A number of universities have abandoned Second Life, some of them moving to OpenSim where they have a bit more control, but many simply disappearing altogether. In addition to the real costs of having a region in Second Life, it's just extremely challenging to create the kind of virtual environment that embodies the best of education. But I venture to say that the students who have done projects on Renaissance Island and those who have been involved here in this course on the Italian Renaissance have had an experience that they'll never forget and have learned things that will stick with them for a lifetime. And that's what teaching and learning are all about. And that's why we're doing it in Second Life. Thank you very much for hearing this little homily, and I'd be interested in your comments about teaching and learning in Second Life. Thank you.